Let's talk a little bit about ButtWink. ButtWink is where our pelvis falls into posterior pelvic tilt. Okay, or in other words, so get to that bottom position, just go as deep as you can, and the pelvis posteriorly tilts, and that's paired with lumbar, go deeper, deeper, around the back more. She's too mobile, so it's pretty hard for her to do it. Okay, but this is where we end up, so the posterior pelvic tilt is paired with flexion of the lumbar spine or rounding of the lumbar spine, so that's no longer neutral. There's a few reasons why this may happen. Okay, sometimes it's a lack of mobility, sometimes it's a lack of position or lack of understanding how to brace correctly. One common error that people make with bracing and holding what they seem to be the optimal position, which is a neutral spine, is using all of the muscles to extend their spine. So all of the erector spinae, so arch as hard as you can, okay? So starting here, right? So let's just do it, put your arms out in front. So going in extreme extension forces you to fall into ButtWink at the bottom. Now, let's explain the mechanism. So when we're arching really, really hard from the beginning, this is called extending the spine. Okay, we're using our erector spinae. Now, extension of the spine is also paired with anterior tilt of the pelvis. Okay, now what happens when we tilt the pelvis anteriorly, go to neutral. So this is neutral. So this is a neutral pelvis position. So if we have a look at this joint here, which is the hip joint, we are at 0 degrees of hip flexion. Okay, so lift one knee, that's 90 degrees of hip flexion. Okay, feet down, 0 degrees of hip flexion. Anteriorly rotate the pelvis. I don't know how many, but that's a few degrees of hip flexion. Okay, because the femur stays fixed, but relative to the upper thigh bone, the pelvis is rotated anteriorly, causing a few degrees of hip joint flexion at the top of the movement. Now, we only have a limited amount of hip joint flexion before we achieve bone on bone. So that's the femur, so that's the upper thigh bone in the pelvis or the acetabulum, so the ball in the socket. We are limited on how many degrees of hip flexion before we are structurally unable to achieve any more flexion. So let's just assume that's bone on bone, and then she goes a few more degrees up, and then the pelvis rotates posteriorly. So we are only limited with the exact amount of hip joint flexion that's available to us. And if you're taking a few valuable degrees at the top of the movement by anteriorly rotating the pelvis, so stand in a squat stance and anteriorly rotate the pelvis, so accentuate that arch. Okay, so we're taking up a few degrees of hip joint flexion now. We're going to lose it at the bottom. So go deep and then ButtWink happens at the bottom. Now, what's the alternative to this? So this is where it's not necessarily a lack of mobility, but rather a lack of knowledge and understanding how to position her body. So what we need to consider here to brace our core isn't to only use our erector spinae to arch our upper backs or our entire backs. We also want to be bracing our anterior core. So what we need to think about is those muscles at the front of our anterior core, rectus abdominis, otherwise known as your six-pack muscles. When a muscle contracts, it gets the bones that it's attached to and brings them two together. Okay, so the six-pack muscles are attached to her rib cage and her pelvis. So when you're arching back, that's stretching those muscles. So they're not contracting, so they're really pointless right now. So to contract those six-pack muscles, what I like to teach people is to brace your abs as if you're going to get punched in the stomach and you want to protect yourself. And what should happen is the rib cage will come down towards the pelvis. So there's two parts for that. It's ribs down, and I don't want to say you're posteriorly rotating your pelvis. I just want it to be neutral. Arch your back. Now I want you to posteriorly rotate your pelvis relative to an anteriorly rotated position. Okay, but I don't want it posteriorly rotated. I want it neutral. So a cue that I might use for that is piss up a wall. So ribs down, posteriorly rotate your pelvis. Okay, or in other words, neutral pelvis, and engage those six-pack muscles. Okay, that is paired with breath hold. Okay, so taking a big breath to brace. Okay, so bracing those six-pack abs as if she's going to protect herself from getting punched in the stomach, opening her hips, okay, and squatting down as deep as her mobility allows. So now what she's done is she started the position with 0 degrees of hip flexion. So she's got 0 hip flexion, completely neutral pelvis and neutral spine. And it allows for her to go as deep as she can without going into ButtWink. Bracing the anterior core and squatting as deep as you can